The cold autumn rain hammered against the weathered wood of the barn as Prudence Everhart clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma tighter against her chest, desperate to shield the child from the biting wind that whistled through the cracks. It was 1878 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and she had nowhere else to go after fleeing her brother-in-law's cruelty with nothing but the clothes on her back and her precious baby. "It's all right, sweet girl," Prudence whispered, pressing her lips against Emma's forehead. "We'll be warm soon." But even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. The thin blanket she'd found in the corner of the barn provided little protection against the October chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. Prudence had arrived in Timber Creek just as dusk was falling, her feet blistered and raw from walking miles after the stagecoach had left her at the last stop. With no money for a room and the town seemingly shut down for the night, the barn on the edge of a large cattle ranch had offered her only refuge. "Just one night," she promised herself. "Tomorrow I'll find work." She had skills. She could sew, cook, clean. Surely someone in this town would need help. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about a young widow with a child and no husband in sight. Emma whimpered softly in her sleep, and Prudence adjusted her position in the hay, wincing as the stalks poked through her thin dress. Exhaustion pulled at her eyelids, but she fought it, fearful of what might happen if she succumbed to sleep in this unfamiliar place. The sound of boots crunching on gravel jerked her awake some time later. She hadn't meant to doze off, but fatigue had won. Now panic surged through her veins as the barn door creaked open, sending a slash of lantern light across the hay-strewn floor. "Who's in here?" a deep voice called out, firm but not immediately threatening. Prudence held her breath, pulling Emma closer to her chest. Perhaps if she stayed quiet, he would leave. The lantern light drew nearer, and then suddenly illuminated her huddled form in the corner. She blinked against the brightness, her free arm instinctively coming up to shield both her face and her daughter. "Please," she whispered. "We mean no harm. We'll be gone by morning." The lantern lowered slightly, and Prudence could make out the tall figure of a man, broad-shouldered and wearing a worn leather coat. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see he was studying her intently. "Madam," he said finally, his voice softening as his eyes fell on the sleeping child, "you can't stay out here. The temperature's dropping, and there's a storm coming in." Prudence swallowed hard. "I have nowhere else to go, sir. We won't trouble you." The man was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "You'll sleep under my roof tonight. Both of you." Fear and suspicion warred with desperate gratitude in Prudence's chest. "I don't know you, sir. Name's Kieran Quinn. This is my ranch." He gestured vaguely to the world outside the barn. "And I'm not in the habit of letting women and babies freeze to death on my property." He extended a hand to help her up, and after a moment's hesitation, Prudence took it. His palm was warm and calloused against her cold fingers. "Prudence Everhart," she offered, struggling to her feet with Emma still clutched to her chest. "And this is my daughter Emma." Kieran nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at the sleeping child. "Let's get you both inside, Mrs. Everhart." "Miss," she corrected automatically, then immediately regretted it. A woman traveling alone with a child and no husband invited assumptions and judgment. But Kieran Quinn merely nodded again, making no comment as he led them out of the barn and toward the main house. The rain had intensified, coming down in sheets now. Kieran removed his coat and held it over Prudence and Emma, sheltering them as they hurried across the yard. His white shirt quickly became soaked, clinging to his frame, but he seemed not to notice the cold. The ranch house was modest but solid, with a wide porch and sturdy walls that blocked out the howling wind. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth, casting the main room in a warm orange glow. The furnishings were simple but well made: a large table with 4 chairs, a sofa covered in what looked like a handmade quilt, and bookshelves lining one wall. "It ain't much," Kieran said, suddenly looking almost embarrassed. "But it's warm and dry." "It's wonderful," Prudence replied sincerely. After weeks of uncertainty and fear, The simple comfort of a roof and a fire felt like unimaginable luxury. "Are you hungry?" Kieran asked, hanging his dripping hat on a peg by the door. As if in answer, Prudence's stomach growled loudly. She flushed with embarrassment, but Kieran just gave a small smile. "I'll take that as a yes. Sit by the fire and warm up. I've got stew left from supper." Prudence sank gratefully onto the sofa, adjusting Emma in her arms. The baby had awakened during their trek to the house and was now looking around with wide, curious eyes. "She's mighty calm," Kieran observed as he moved about the kitchen. "Most babies I've known would be raising a fuss after being woken up and carried through a storm. She's seen worse," Prudence murmured, then pressed her lips together, not wanting to say more. If Kieran noticed her reticence, he didn't push. Instead, he brought over a bowl of steaming stew and a chunk of bread. "Eat. I'll hold the little one if you'd like." Prudence hesitated. She hadn't let anyone else hold Emma since they'd fled her brother-in-law's house. Seeming to sense her unease, Kieran stepped back. "Or not?" "Your choice, Miss Everhart." Something in his respectful retreat reassured her. "Thank you, but I can manage," she said, shifting Emma to her lap so she could eat with one hand. Kieran nodded and took a seat in the chair opposite, giving her space. "Where are you headed?" he asked after she'd had a few mouthfuls of the surprisingly good stew. "I'm not sure," Prudence admitted. "Somewhere I can find work. I heard Timber Creek was growing." "It is," Kieran confirmed. "Though jobs for women with young ones aren't easy to come by." "I can do almost anything," Prudence said, a note of determination entering her voice. "I cook, clean, sew. I helped run my father's general store before." She trailed off, the memories of her father's death and her hasty marriage to John Everhart still too painful to discuss. Kieran seemed to understand her reluctance to continue. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you get your bearings. I've got a spare room. It's small, but it's private." Prudence stared at him in surprise. "That's very generous, Mr. Quinn, but I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition," he interrupted. "Truth be told, this place could use a woman's touch. It's been just me since my foreman Ben and his wife moved to their own place last spring." "You run this ranch alone?" Prudence asked, impressed despite herself. The property had seemed substantial from what little she'd seen. "Got a couple of hands that help with the cattle, but they've got their own quarters near the south pasture." Kieran ran a hand through his dark hair, which was drying into waves. "I manage." Emma chose that moment to let out a small yawn, her tiny fists rubbing at her eyes. The action drew a smile from Kieran that transformed his weathered face, softening the lines around his eyes. "Looks like someone's ready for bed," he said. "Let me show you to your room." The spare bedroom was indeed small, but it was clean and contained a bed with fresh linens and a small dresser. A basin and pitcher sat atop a washstand in the corner. "Bathroom's down the hall," Kieran explained. "I'll leave you to get settled. There's a nightgown in the dresser belonged to Ben's wife. She left some things behind. Might be a bit big, but it's clean." "Thank you," Prudence said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "For everything." Kieran nodded, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Get some rest, Miss Everhart. Things always look clearer in the morning." After he left, Prudence changed Emma's cloth diaper, using one of the clean rags she found in the dresser. She then discovered the nightgown Kieran had mentioned, a simple cotton garment that was indeed too large, but infinitely more comfortable than sleeping in her travel-worn dress. As she settled into the bed with Emma nestled against her, Prudence found herself wondering about the quiet rancher who had so easily offered them shelter. Kindness without expectation was rare in her experience, and she couldn't help but wait for the other shoe to drop. But as sleep claimed her, her last thought was that perhaps, just this once, kindness might be exactly what it appeared to be. Morning brought pale sunlight streaming through the curtains, and the unfamiliar sound of someone moving about in the kitchen. For a moment, Prudence was disoriented, until the events of the previous night came flooding back. Emma was already awake beside her, contentedly playing with a loose thread on the quilt. Prudence smiled down at her daughter, grateful for the child's easy nature. "Good morning, sweet pea," she whispered, pressing a kiss to Emma's soft cheek. After changing into her own dress, somewhat wrinkled but at least dry now, and tending to Emma, Prudence made her way to the kitchen, where she found Kieran at the stove, frying bacon. "Morning," he greeted, glancing over his shoulder. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," Prudence admitted. "Can I help with breakfast?" "Sit," he instructed, nodding toward the table that had already been set with plates and mugs. "Coffee's hot." Prudence hesitated, unaccustomed to being waited on, but sat with Emma on her lap. The rich aroma of coffee made her stomach growl again, reminding her how long it had been since she'd had regular meals. "Does she eat solid food yet?" Kieran asked, bringing over a plate piled with bacon, eggs, and biscuits. "She's just starting to," Prudence replied, surprised by his knowledge of babies. "Mostly soft things." Kieran nodded and returned to the stove, coming back with a small bowl. "Mashed some potato from last night with a bit of milk. Should be soft enough." Touched by his consideration, Prudence felt a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Emma happily gumming the mashed potato while Prudence savored the simple but delicious food. "I have to ride out and check the herd after breakfast," Kieran said eventually. "You're welcome to stay here. Rest up. There's food in the pantry for lunch." "I should be moving on," Prudence protested half-heartedly. "I need to find work." Kieran studied her over the rim of his coffee mug. "Town's quiet on Sundays. Not much hiring happening. Stay today at least, head into town tomorrow if you're set on it." Prudence hesitated, torn between her desire for independence and the practical benefits of another day of safety and rest. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Kieran said simply. "Besides, Emma seems to like it here." He nodded toward the baby, who was watching him with curious eyes while continuing to smear potato across her face. Despite herself, Prudence laughed. "She does seem comfortable." The realization was surprising. Emma usually took time to warm up to strangers, especially men. "It's settled then," Kieran said, rising from the table. "I'll be back before sundown. Make yourself at home." After he left, Prudence cleaned up the breakfast dishes, then explored the house more thoroughly. It was well built but clearly in need of a woman's touch, as Kieran had said. Dust had gathered in corners, and the curtains looked as though they hadn't been washed in months. Almost without conscious decision, Prudence found herself rolling up her sleeves. If she was going to accept Kieran's hospitality for another day, the least she could do was leave his house cleaner than she found it. By mid-afternoon, she had swept and scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and beaten the dust from the rugs. Emma napped contentedly in a makeshift bed Prudence had created from a basket and some clean linens, waking only for feeding and changing. In the kitchen, Prudence discovered a well-stocked pantry and root cellar. Feeling inspired, she decided to prepare a proper dinner as further thanks for Kieran's kindness. She hadn't cooked a real meal in weeks, and the simple task of kneading dough for bread and peeling vegetables for a stew gave her a sense of normalcy she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The sun was just beginning to dip toward the horizon when Prudence heard hoofbeats approaching. She smoothed her hair nervously, suddenly aware of how presumptuous it might seem to have taken over his kitchen. Kieran entered, stamping mud from his boots at the door. He stopped short, inhaling deeply. "Something smells mighty good. I hope you don't mind," Prudence said quickly. "I made stew and bread." "As a thank you?" Kieran's expression softened. "Mind? Miss Everhart, I can't remember the last time I came home to a home-cooked meal that I didn't have to prepare myself." Prudence felt a blush warming her cheeks at the genuine gratitude in his voice. "It's the least I could do after your kindness." "I notice you've done more than cook," Kieran said, looking around at the now spotless house. "You didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," Prudence replied honestly. "It felt good to be useful." Something flickered in Kieran's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who needed purpose as much as shelter. Well, I appreciate it. Let me just wash up, and we can eat. Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Kieran praising the food and Prudence finding herself relaxing enough to ask about his ranch and his life in Timber Creek. He spoke openly about the challenges of ranching in Wyoming territory, about the harsh winters and the satisfaction of a successful spring calving. How did you end up here? Prudence asked as they finished the apple cobbler she'd made for dessert. Kieran was silent for a moment, absently stirring the last bite of cobbler around his plate. Came west after the war. Needed open spaces after what I saw. The haunted look that briefly crossed his face told Prudence all she needed to know. My husband was in the war too, she said softly. He came back changed. Most of us did, Kieran acknowledged. He glanced at Emma, who was contentedly playing with a wooden spoon Prudence had given her. Your husband died, Prudence said, the half-truth sticking in her throat. John had indeed died, but it was what came after his death that had forced her to flee. Pneumonia, last winter. I'm sorry, Kieran said, and she could tell he meant it. It's not easy being alone. No, Prudence agreed, meeting his gaze. It's not. Something unspoken passed between them then, a recognition of shared loneliness that neither was quite ready to acknowledge further. The moment was broken when Emma dropped her spoon with a clatter, then yawned widely, her small face scrunching up with tiredness. Looks like someone's ready for bed, Kieran observed with a small smile. Yes, it's past her usual time, Prudence agreed, standing to gather Emma in her arms. Thank you for dinner, or rather, for providing the ingredients. I should put her down. Of course, Kieran said, also rising. I'll clean up here. Oh, but I can, you cooked, he interrupted gently. It's only fair I clean. Go on, get the little one to sleep. Prudence nodded, oddly touched by his insistence on sharing the household duties. Good night, then. Good night, Miss Everhart, Kieran replied, his voice warm. Sleep well. In the small bedroom, as Prudence settled Emma for the night, she found herself contemplating her situation with clearer eyes than she'd had in weeks. Tomorrow she would go into town, look for work, try to establish herself and Emma somewhere safe. But for the first time since fleeing her brother-in-law's house, she didn't feel the gnawing panic that had become her constant companion. One day at a time, she told herself. That was all she could manage for now. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Kieran offered to drive Prudence and Emma into town in his wagon, an offer she gratefully accepted. Timber Creek was larger than Prudence had initially thought, with a main street boasting several businesses, a general store, a bank, a hotel, and various other establishments that spoke of a growing community. Town's been growing steadily since the railroad spur came through last year, Kieran explained as he guided the wagon down the main street. Makes it easier to ship cattle, brings in more settlers. Do you know if anyone might be hiring? Prudence asked, her eyes scanning the storefronts hopefully. Kieran hesitated. Mrs. Wilson at the hotel sometimes needs help with cleaning and laundry. And the general store might need an extra hand. Owner's wife just had their 4th child. Prudence nodded, making mental notes. I'll start there then. Thank you. Kieran pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. I've got some business at the bank. Meet you back here in a couple hours? You don't have to wait, Prudence protested. I'm sure I can find a place to stay in town. Something like disappointment flashed across Kieran's face. If that's what you want, he said carefully. But the offer to stay at the ranch still stands. At least until you find your feet. Prudence found herself torn. The practical part of her knew she should establish her independence as quickly as possible. But another part, a part that had been starved for kindness and safety, was reluctant to walk away from the security Kieran offered. Let me see what I can find out about work first, she finally said. Then I'll decide. Kieran nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. I'll be at the bank, then the feed store. Find me if you need anything. The general store proved to be a disappointment. While the owner, Mr. Peterson, was sympathetic to Prudence's situation, his wife's younger sister had already moved in to help with the new baby and the store. "Might try the hotel," he suggested kindly. "Mrs. Wilson's always looking for good help." At the hotel, Prudence had more luck. Mrs. Wilson, a brisk, efficient woman in her 50s, looked Prudence up and down with shrewd eyes. "Experience with laundry and cleaning?" she asked. "Yes, madam," Prudence confirmed. "And cooking, though I understand you have a cook already." Mrs. Wilson said, her gaze softening slightly as it fell on Emma, who was being unusually well behaved in Prudence's arms. "Child complicates things. Can't have a baby in the laundry room too hot, too many chemicals." "I understand," Prudence said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Thank you for your time." She turned to leave, but Mrs. Wilson's voice stopped her. "Hold on, girl. Didn't say I wouldn't hire you. Just need to figure out arrangements." Hope surged in Prudence's chest. "I'm willing to work hard, Mrs. Wilson." "I believe you are," the older woman said. "Tell you what, I need someone to help with the mending and ironing of linens. Could set you up in a small room off the laundry. Cooler there, safer for the baby. Pays $3 a week, plus room and board." It was a fair offer, better than Prudence had dared hope for. "When would you need me to start?" "Right away," Mrs. Wilson said. "Rooms available now." I'd need to collect my things," Prudence said, thinking of the few possessions she'd left at Kieran's ranch. And if she was honest with herself, she needed to say a proper goodbye to the kind rancher who had taken them in. "Tomorrow morning, then," Mrs. Wilson decided. "Be here at 7 sharp." "Yes, madam," Prudence agreed. "Thank you." Outside the hotel, Prudence stood for a moment on the boardwalk, Emma balanced on her hip, and allowed herself a small smile. A job, a place to live, it was more than she'd had yesterday. Yet instead of pure relief, she felt an unexpected twinge of sadness at the thought of leaving Kieran's ranch. Don't be foolish, she chided herself. She barely knew the man. It made no sense to feel attached to someone she'd met only 2 days ago. She found Kieran at the feed store, loading sacks of grain into his wagon. He straightened when he saw her, his expression questioning. "I got a job," she told him. "At the hotel. Mrs. Wilson needs help with mending and ironing. I start tomorrow." "That's good news," Kieran said, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "She's offering you a room, might take it." "Yes," Prudence confirmed. "For Emma and me both." Kieran nodded, turning back to the wagon to secure the grain sacks. "Well, if you need to get your things, I'm ready to head back to the ranch." The ride back was quieter than the journey into town had been, a certain tension hanging between them that Prudence didn't know how to address. Emma, sensing the change in mood, became fussy, requiring Prudence's attention for much of the journey. At the ranch, Prudence quickly gathered her few belongings, tidied the room they had used, and prepared to leave. But as she stepped back into the main room, her meager bundle in one arm and Emma in the other, she found herself reluctant to walk out the door. "I can't thank you enough," she said to Kieran, who was standing by the fireplace, watching her with an unreadable expression. "For everything." "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice gruff. Then, more hesitantly, "You sure about the hotel job? It's hard work, and with the baby." "I don't have many options," Prudence reminded him gently. Kieran ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "You could stay here." Prudence blinked in surprise. "I can't keep accepting your charity, Mr. Quinn." "Not charity," he said quickly. "I could use help around the place. Cooking, cleaning, the things you already did yesterday. I'd pay you, of course. Same as Mrs. Wilson, plus you'd have more space for Emma. Fresh air, too." The offer was tempting more than tempting. The ranch was peaceful, safe, and Emma had indeed seemed content here. But Prudence was wary of becoming too dependent on a single person again. "Why would you do this?" she asked, needing to understand his motivation. "You hardly know me." Kieran was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace. "I know what it's like to be alone," he finally said. "To have nowhere to turn. After the war, if it hadn't been for a stranger's kindness, I wouldn't be standing here today." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep inside Prudence. "And that's the only reason?" Kieran's eyes met hers, and she saw in them a vulnerability that matched her own. "No," he admitted quietly. "I like having you here. Both of you. The house feels different with you in it. Better." Prudence felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "I promise, Mrs. Wilson, I'd start tomorrow." "I understand," Kieran said, though disappointment was clear in his voice. "But," Prudence continued carefully, "perhaps I could explain the situation to her. See if she might be willing to let me take this position instead." Hope flickered across Kieran's face. "You'd stay?" "On a trial basis," Prudence clarified, not wanting to commit too quickly despite the pull she felt toward this quiet, kind man. "To see if the arrangement works for both of us." "That seems fair," Kieran agreed, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "Very fair." The next morning, Prudence made the trip into town alone, leaving Emma in Kieran's surprisingly capable care after he assured her he had experience with babies from helping his sister with her children years ago. Mrs. Wilson was understanding about Prudence's change of plans, particularly when she explained the advantages of the ranch position for Emma. "Can't say I blame you," the older woman said. "Quinn's a good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but honest as the day is long. Lost his wife in childbirth about 5 years back, from what I hear. Baby too." The revelation sent a shock through Prudence. Suddenly, Kieran's knowledge of babies and his kindness toward Emma made painful sense. "I didn't know," she murmured. "Not something he talks about," Mrs. Wilson said. "But it explains why he's never remarried, despite being one of the most eligible bachelors in the county." Prudence returned to the ranch with a new understanding of the man who had offered them shelter. She found Kieran in the barn with Emma, who was giggling as he showed her a newly hatched clutch of chicks in a straw-lined box. "Mrs. Wilson understood," Prudence said by way of greeting. "She wished me well." Kieran looked up, relief evident in his expression. "I'm glad to hear it. She told me about your wife," Prudence added gently. "And your baby. I'm so sorry, Kieran." His face stilled, and for a moment Prudence feared she had overstepped. But then he nodded slowly. "Hannah. And the baby was a boy. We were going to name him after my father." "It's why you helped us, isn't it?" Prudence asked. "Emma and me." Kieran considered this, gently stroking one of the chicks with a fingertip as Emma watched in fascination. "Maybe at first," he admitted. "But now I just want you both here because you belong here." The simple declaration, delivered without dramatic flair but with quiet sincerity, moved Prudence deeply. "I think perhaps we do," she whispered. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Prudence took over the running of the household, cooking meals that brought genuine delight to Kieran's face, keeping the house clean and comfortable, and even starting a small kitchen garden that promised fresh vegetables come spring. Kieran, for his part, taught Prudence about ranch life, showing her how to collect eggs safely, how to milk the cow he kept for household use, and even, on quiet evenings, how to ride the gentle mare he had in his stable. Emma thrived in the open air and freedom of the ranch, growing stronger and more curious by the day. To Prudence's amazement, the baby formed a special bond with Kieran, lighting up whenever he entered a room and reaching for him with chubby arms that he never failed to respond to. "She has good taste," Kieran commented one evening as Emma fell asleep against his chest while he read the newspaper. "Smart girl, just like her mama." The compliment warmed Prudence, as did the sight of her daughter so comfortable with this man who had become increasingly important to both of them. As autumn deepened toward winter, Prudence became aware of a shift in her feelings toward Kieran. What had begun as gratitude had developed into respect, friendship, And now something more, something that made her pulse quicken when their hands accidentally touched, or when she caught him looking at her with an expression that mirrored her own confused emotions. Yet neither of them spoke of these feelings, each perhaps too wounded by past loss to risk further pain. It was an early December snowstorm that finally broke the careful distance they had maintained. The blizzard had struck suddenly, forcing Kieran to battle his way back to the house from checking on the herd. He arrived half frozen, his face raw from the wind and his clothing stiff with ice. Prudence had helped him shed his frozen outer layers, her hands trembling as she guided him to the fire and wrapped him in blankets, fear making her voice sharp as she scolded him for taking such risks. "Had to check the cattle," he said through chattering teeth. "My responsibility." "And who would take care of your ranch if you froze to death out there?" Prudence demanded, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands. "Who would take care of—" She stopped abruptly, realizing what she had been about to say. Kieran looked up at her, the color slowly returning to his face. "Take care of who, Prudence?" he asked softly. "Us," she whispered, the word escaping before she could reconsider. "Emma and me." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotion. Then Kieran set aside the coffee cup and reached for her hand. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice rough with more than just the cold. "To stay? Not just as my housekeeper, but as more?" Prudence felt tears welling in her eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Of wanting too much, of losing again." "So am I," Kieran confessed, his grip on her hand tightening. "Every day since you and Emma came into my life, I've been afraid of what it would do to me when you eventually left. But I'm more afraid now of never telling you what you've come to mean to me." A tear spilled down Prudence's cheek. "And what is that?" she asked, needing to hear the words. "Everything," Kieran said simply. "You and Emma, you're everything to me now. I love you both, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." The declaration, so straightforward and honest, broke through the last of Prudence's hesitation. "We love you too," she whispered. "I never thought I'd find this again, safety, happiness. Love." Kieran stood then, drawing her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Stay with me," he murmured against her hair. "Be my wife. Let me be a father to Emma." "Yes," Prudence said without hesitation, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. "Yes to all of it." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Timber Creek, with Emma, dressed in a new white dress that Mrs. Wilson had helped sew, babbling happily in the arms of Kieran's foreman Ben, who served as best man. That evening, as they stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the stars emerge in the clear winter sky, Kieran wrapped his arm around Prudence's waist and pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you remember what I said to you that first night?" he asked. Prudence smiled, leaning into his embrace. "You said I'd sleep under your roof." "I meant it just for that night," Kieran admitted. "But somehow, I think a part of me always knew it would be forever." "Forever," Prudence echoed, turning in his arms to meet his lips with hers, the promise of their future together warming her more thoroughly than any fire ever could. And as they stood there, the small family that had been formed through chance and kindness and eventually love, Prudence knew that sometimes the greatest journeys began with the simplest acts of compassion, like offering shelter to a woman and her child on a cold autumn night.